she walked into the elegant music hall with her head down, just another invisible worker in her faded uniform. They only noticed her when they needed someone to humiliate for their own amusement. But when they forced her to play the piano as a cruel joke, what happened next left the entire room speechless. By the time her fingers left the keys, the woman they had mocked became the woman they would never forget. Emily Johnson moved quietly between the polished marble columns of the Preston Music Conservatory, the soft squeak of her worn sneakers against the floor a stark contrast to the melodic Chopin echoing from the practice rooms. At 28, she wore the beige uniform of the custodial staff with quiet dignity, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her movements efficient as she emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces. 3 years of working here, and most days, she remained as invisible as the dust she removed from antique picture frames. She'd grown accustomed to the way students and faculty looked past her, their eyes sliding over her uniform to focus on something more important. In the main hall, she paused to adjust a slightly crooked portrait of a stern-faced composer before continuing her rounds. Her hands, though roughened by cleaning chemicals, moved with a grace that might have seemed unusual to anyone who bothered to notice. "Emily, can you handle the reception area today? We've got the foundation board coming in," her supervisor called out, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Yes, Mr. Collins," she replied softly. As she moved toward the grand reception area with its soaring ceilings and wall-length windows, Emily caught a glimpse of the magnificent Steinway in the corner, the centerpiece of countless recitals and fundraisers. For just a moment, her expression shifted, a whisper of longing crossing her face. In the reflection of a polished brass lamp, she saw herself as she once was, 15 years younger, seated at a similar piano, her future stretched before her like an unwritten symphony. But that was before life had intervened. Before choices, made from love rather than ambition, had set her on a different path. Emily shook her head slightly and continued with her work. The past was the past. This was her life now. And she had made her peace with it. Or so she told herself each morning. Victoria Parker strode through the reception area, her heels striking the marble with authoritative clicks. At 53, she commanded the conservatory with the same precision she once brought to concert stages across Europe. Her tailored navy suit and perfectly styled silver bob projected the image she had carefully cultivated: success, refinement, unquestionable authority. "Those chairs need to be exactly 1 inch apart, not this haphazard arrangement," she instructed, barely glancing at Emily. "The Jefferson Foundation representatives expect perfection." "Yes, Mrs. Parker," Emily replied, immediately moving to adjust the chairs. From across the room, Samantha Reed observed the exchange with a barely concealed smirk. As the conservatory's star piano instructor, Samantha had built her reputation on producing competition winners and maintaining exacting standards. "Victoria, do remind the staff that they should use the service corridors when the guests arrive," Samantha called out, her voice carrying just enough to ensure Emily heard. "Last time, I noticed some of them in plain sight during the Chopin competition." Emily's cheeks warmed, but her hands remained steady as she continued arranging chairs. These small humiliations had become as routine as dusting the trophy cases. Later, as Emily polished the brass handrail along the grand staircase, she paused at the sound of a student struggling through a difficult passage on the piano. Through the partially open door, she could see a young girl, maybe 12, her frustration evident as she repeatedly stumbled over the same measures. Without thinking, Emily whispered, "Try releasing your wrist more on the arpeggios." The girl turned, startled, just as Samantha appeared beside her. "Did you just try to instruct my student?" Samantha's voice cut through the air like ice. "I'm sorry, You just what? Thought your expertise as a janitor qualified you to comment on piano technique?" Samantha's laugh was sharp. "Please, stick to what you know: cleaning supplies and trash collection." Emily's eyes dropped to the floor as the door closed firmly in her face. She resumed her polishing, shoulders slightly more hunched than before. What Samantha couldn't see was Emily's fingers moving imperceptibly against the railing, tracing the notes of the piece the student had been playing, correcting, perfecting, completing the passage in a silent performance that no one would ever witness. The day of the annual fundraising gala arrived with a flurry of activity. The conservatory gleamed under Emily's careful attention, every surface polished, every chair perfectly aligned. Wealthy patrons would soon fill these halls, their donations determining which programs flourished and which withered in the coming year. Emily worked quietly in the reception area when Samantha burst through the double doors, phone clutched against her ear, face tight with panic. "What do you mean you're in the hospital?" Her voice echoed across the marble floor. "The gala starts in an hour, Olivia." "You can't possibly," she paused, listening, her expression darkening. "Food poisoning? Today, of all days?" As Samantha ended the call, Victoria rushed toward her, sensing disaster. "What's happened?" "Olivia can't perform. She's in the emergency room." Victoria's hand flew to her pearl necklace. "But she's our centerpiece. The Jefferson Foundation specifically requested Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody." "I know that," Samantha snapped, then lowered her voice. "None of my other students can handle that piece without preparation." Jason Miller, a young teaching assistant who had always acknowledged Emily with simple kindness, "A good morning here, a thank you there," approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Parker, if I might make a suggestion?" Victoria turned, desperate for solutions. "What is it, Jason?" He hesitated, then continued. "I've heard someone else play that piece. Quite brilliantly, actually." "Who?" "Professor Williams is out of town. Unless you're suggesting one of the graduate students." "No, actually." Jason's eyes drifted toward Emily, who was dusting a nearby display case, seemingly oblivious to their crisis. "I'm suggesting Emily." The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha recovered first, a laugh bursting from her lips. "The janitor? You can't be serious." "I've heard her playing after hours, when she thought the building was empty," Jason continued, undeterred. "She's remarkable." Victoria and Samantha exchanged incredulous glances before both turning to stare at Emily, who had now frozen in place, duster suspended in midair. "Is this true?" Victoria demanded. "You play piano?" Emily lowered the duster slowly, her cheeks coloring. "Yes, ma'am." "And you think you could play Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody?" Samantha's tone made it clear how absurd she found the very suggestion. Emily hesitated, then met Samantha's eyes directly, for perhaps the first time in 3 years. "Yes, ma'am. I can." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied Emily, truly seeing her, for perhaps the first time. "You honestly believe you could perform at our fundraising gala?" Emily stood perfectly still, caught in the unexpected spotlight of their attention. "Let me understand this," Samantha interjected, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can step in for Olivia Sanders, who's been training at elite institutions since she was 5? Emily's reply was simple. "I know the piece." Richard Taylor, chairman of the board, approached their small circle, his curiosity piqued by the unusual tension. "What's the problem, Victoria?" Victoria forced a smile, an artificial laugh escaping her lips. "Apparently," she said, glancing toward Emily, "our custodian believes she can save our gala performance." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly as he assessed Emily, his gaze traveling from her practical shoes to her simple uniform, lingering on her hands that had just been emptying trash bins and polishing surfaces. "Well," he said slowly, a certain gleam appearing in his eyes, "this is certainly unexpected." Samantha leaned closer to Victoria and Richard, lowering her voice, though not enough to prevent Emily from hearing. "It might actually work to our advantage. We could present it as part of our community outreach efforts. If she's terrible, we make a self-deprecating joke about our desperate situation. If she's passable, we look generous for giving the help a moment in the spotlight." Victoria's expression shifted as she considered the possibilities. "The donors might find it charming, a little entertainment before we explain about Olivia's unfortunate situation." Emily stood silent, invisible once more as they discussed her as if she were an object, a prop for their performance rather than a person with feelings and dignity. "It's settled then," Victoria announced, turning back to Emily. "You'll play tonight. One piece." "The Liszt." Emily hesitated. "And if I refuse?" Her question hung in the air, surprising even herself with its boldness. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. Then we'll need to reassess whether your position here is still necessary. Budget cuts, you understand. In that moment, Emily faced a choice that reached far beyond music. This was about her dignity. Her identity. The parts of herself she had carefully hidden away. This was about standing up. Or backing down. The grand hall filled with the conservatory's most generous patrons, their evening attire glittering under crystal chandeliers. In the wings, Emily stood alone, still in her beige uniform, the name tag Emily J. pinned to her chest like a scarlet letter identifying her as an outsider. As other. Victoria tapped the microphone, her practiced smile gleaming. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight change to our program tonight. Our scheduled pianist had an unfortunate emergency. She paused, her voice taking on a theatrical quality. However, in the spirit of our community outreach initiatives, we have a special alternative performance. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Victoria continued. One of our maintenance staff has volunteered to demonstrate how music touches all lives, regardless of background or training. The introduction hung in the air like a veiled insult as Emily walked onto the stage, the spotlight harsh against her simple clothes. A few titters of laughter floated from the back of the room. Samantha stood near the curtain, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at her lips, like a cat who'd trapped a mouse for its own amusement. Emily sat at the magnificent grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the uncertainty in her eyes. 15 years. 15 years since she had played like this. Not in an empty room. Not on her grandmother's worn upright piano. But here. Before an audience. Never like this. Never with judgment waiting to fall on her like an executioner's blade. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. In the front row, Richard leaned toward his companion with a stage whisper. This should be entertaining, if nothing else. Emily closed her eyes, shutting out the world that had tried so hard to erase her. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she found herself sitting beside her grandmother, an old woman with arthritis-bent fingers, who had once played with symphony orchestras. Music isn't about who you are to the world, her grandmother had told her. It's about who you are when the world falls away. Emily's fingers touched the keys. The first notes of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 filled the hall. Not the hesitant attempts they had expected. But confident. Masterful. Commanding. Emily's hands moved with precision and passion, telling a story through music that she had never been allowed to tell in words. The whispers died. The smirks froze. 200 breathing souls fell completely silent. As the piece progressed through its demanding technical passages, Emily's body swayed with the changing moods, her face transformed by the music flowing through her. The playful sections danced with whimsical grace. The thundering crescendos resonated against the very foundations of the hall. In the third row, an elderly patron wiped away tears. At the back, a renowned music critic, who happened to be in attendance, leaned forward, his expression a mixture of shock and reverence. Victoria's face had lost all color. Samantha stood rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the curtain. And Jason watched with quiet vindication. A witness to truth revealing itself, note by perfect note. When Emily played the final, thunderous chord, the hall remained suspended in silence for 3 heartbeats. Then it erupted. The applause began hesitantly at first, as if the audience couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed, before swelling into a standing ovation. Calls of bravo echoed through the hall, bouncing off marble columns and crystal chandeliers. People who, moments before, had been prepared to politely endure a custodian's amateur attempt were now on their feet, their faces alight with genuine emotion. Emily sat motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the response. When she finally rose and offered a small, humble bow, the applause intensified. David Thompson, a respected conductor who had been invited as a special guest, made his way to the stage as Emily attempted to slip backstage. "Wait," he called, his authoritative voice cutting through the applause. "Young lady, where did you study?" Emily turned back, the spotlight still harsh against her uniform. "I didn't, sir. Not formally." The murmurs resumed as David approached her. "That's impossible.
Your technique, your interpretation.
My grandmother taught me, Emily said softly, her voice somehow carrying throughout the now silent hall.
Margaret Johnson?
Recognition dawned in David's eyes.
Margaret Johnson. The Margaret Johnson, who played with the National Symphony in the 70s? Emily nodded.
She raised me after my parents died.
We couldn't afford conservatory tuition, but she taught me everything she knew.
Victoria stepped forward, her professional mask firmly back in place.
How fascinating. What a wonderful human interest story.
Emily turned to her, her voice steady. It's not a story, she said quietly.
It's my life.
The dignity in her voice silenced Victoria more effectively than any sharp retort could have. I was accepted to Juilliard 15 years ago, Emily continued, looking directly at Samantha now.
But my grandmother had a stroke that same week. I stayed to care for her. By the time she passed, there were medical bills. And the opportunity was gone.
David Thompson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. So you took a job here, to stay close to music?
Yes. Emily's simple answer contained volumes.
About sacrifice.
About dreams deferred, but not abandoned.
About finding ways to remain connected to what you love, even when the path forward seems blocked. In that moment, standing in her uniform under the unforgiving spotlight, Emily Johnson became more than just the woman who cleaned their halls.
She became, undeniably and irrevocably, human in their eyes.
The elegant reception hall buzzed with excitement as Emily stood surrounded by patrons who had never before noticed her existence. Their eyes, once sliding past her uniform as if she were part of the furniture, now sought her out with eager curiosity and newfound respect. Your interpretation of the middle section was extraordinary, remarked a silver-haired woman who had donated the funds for the East Wing. So much emotional depth.
Emily accepted the praise with quiet grace, neither shrinking from it nor reveling in it.
Across the room, Victoria Parker moved through the crowd with mechanical precision, her professional smile strained as she fielded questions about the remarkable discovery in their midst. Of course, we recognized her potential, Victoria insisted to a major donor. Our community outreach programs are designed precisely to nurture such hidden talents. Nearby, Samantha Reed stood alone by the refreshment table, her usual circle of admirers noticeably absent. She watched as her most promising students gathered around Emily, their eyes shining with the kind of genuine admiration no credentials could command.
Jason approached Emily with 2 glasses of sparkling water, offering her one.
I told you they'd be amazed, he said quietly.
Emily took the glass, offering him a small, grateful smile. Thank you for speaking up, she replied. Not many people would have.
Before Jason could respond, David Thompson rejoined them, now accompanied by Elizabeth Chen, the head of the Jefferson Foundation. Miss Johnson, Elizabeth began, her expression thoughtful.
Our foundation believes that talent should never be limited by circumstance.
We've been searching for someone to lead our new initiative for underprivileged youth, someone who understands both musical excellence and real-world barriers. Emily's eyes widened slightly as she realized what was being offered.
The position would include teaching and performing, David added.
Your story, and your extraordinary talent, could inspire countless young people who believe certain doors are closed to them. As they spoke, Emily noticed Richard Taylor watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably, like tectonic plates after an earthquake, leaving everyone to navigate unfamiliar terrain. 3 months later, Emily walked through the same hallway she had once cleaned, now carrying sheet music instead of cleaning supplies.
The transformation wasn't dramatic or instantaneous. No fairy tale ending where the janitor became a princess overnight. Reality was more nuanced. More meaningful. She still wore simple clothes, though no longer a uniform.
Her new position with the Jefferson Foundation's Music Within Reach program gave her the chance to work with students from backgrounds like her own, talented kids for whom traditional paths seemed impossible. As she passed the reception area, she nodded to Victoria, who returned the gesture with a tight smile.
Their relationship had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, if not warmth.
Some lessons were learned slowly.
If at all.
In the East Wing practice room, 8 teenagers waited for her, their faces a mix of hopeful and guarded. They came from neighborhoods where music programs had been cut, where pianos were luxuries beyond reach. My grandmother used to say that music isn't about who you are to the world, Emily told them as she sat at the piano.
It's about who you are when the world falls away.
She began to play, just as she had that night.
Not to prove anything,
but because music was her truth. As her students watched, their eyes widening at what was possible, Emily finally understood. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply being who you are, without apology, in a world that tries to make you invisible. As Emily's story reminds us, true talent doesn't always announce itself with credentials and pedigrees. Sometimes, it waits quietly in the shadows. In the hands that serve rather than command. In the hearts that have learned resilience through sacrifice.
How many Emilys walk among us unnoticed? How many gifts remain hidden because we're too quick to judge by appearances, too comfortable in our assumptions about who belongs where? Have you ever been underestimated or judged unfairly? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone reveal unexpected talents that changed how you saw them? Share your story in the comments below.
Your experience might inspire others facing similar challenges. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us bring more of these powerful, life-affirming stories to light. Remember, sometimes, the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Until next time, keep looking beyond the surface.